Welcome back. Last time we looked at the conclusion of the narrative of the cure of the man born blind. In particular, we examined the last three scenes of that narrative. The encounter of the man's parents with the Jews, the second encounter of the cured man with the Jews, in which he shows his developing discovery of just who Jesus was, to the distress of the Jews who summarily threw him out from the Sanhedrin chamber. And finally, we saw the encounter between the cured man and Jesus, where he makes his great act of faith, proving that he not only gained physical sight, but also a deep spiritual insight. In this current session, we move to a wonderful text of the Gospel of John, the Good Shepherd. We begin by giving some background on the shepherd theme in the Old Testament. This will be followed by a short discussion of the literary form of parable, which many think is the form of this narrative. Then we shall examine the connection of this narrative to the preceding blind man text. And finally, we'll look at the text itself, which divides itself into three parts. First, a picture of the shepherd and his flock, which is followed by two different interpretations of that picture, which provide the meaning of the text. The basic background for this narrative is the parable of the shepherds, which is found in the book of the prophet Ezekiel, chapters 34, 1-16. It tells us of the ills of the leadership of Israel in the time of Ezekiel and before. They basically have been more interested in themselves and their own comforts rather than paying attention to the needs of the people. These shepherds clearly are the leaders of the people. This is followed by a discussion of what God will do because of these ills. He will remove them as shepherds, leaders, and God himself will shepherd his flock. The Ezekiel text thus ends with a praise of God as the shepherds of Israel, as the shepherd of Israel. Many interpreters see this unit of the gospel as one of the few illustrations of the Johannine use of the literary form of parable. So it will be advantageous to take a few moments to look at that literary form. The word parable comes from two Greek words, para, which is a preposition meaning beside or next to, and the verb balo, which means to throw, literally, but more genteelly it can mean to put or to place. Hence, a parable is putting one thing beside or next to another. Ideally, parables take examples or instances from the common ordinary life of the hearers and uses them to illustrate, puts them beside, difficult concepts. Jesus has been well known to use parables to illustrate what he's talking about when he spoke of the kingdom of heaven, particularly in the Synoptic Gospels. Given that definition, the German scholar Adolf Ulicher notes that a parable is composed of three elements, or components. Being German, he gives them mostly German names. The first is die Sache, which is the thing, or the unknown that's being illustrated. The second is das Bild, which is the picture, or the known that's used to illustrate the thing. The third, which is the most significant, is the point at which these two intersect, their point of communality. That gives the meaning to the parable. Ulicher chose a Latin name for that, namely the tertium comparationis, or the third or point of comparison. Now, having looked at the literary form of parable, there's one other point that needs to be addressed before we launch into a discussion of the parable, and that's its relation to what has gone before. What makes this necessary is the fact that there is no real change of scene between the blind man episode and this text on the Good Shepherd. The latter seems to flow directly from the former as a continuation. We ended the blind man scene noting that the blind man was cured, that is, he sees, and that he has insight into who Jesus, who cured him, was. He, in essence, becomes a disciple of Jesus. The Jews, or the Pharisees, who are the authority figures in the narrative, come off blind at the end. They have no insight into who Jesus is. And when the blind man expresses his faith, he's ejected from their presence. Now comes a text that portrays Jesus in the context of the Old Testament as a shepherd. But not only shepherd, but good shepherd. The question then becomes, who is this text addressed to? Seemingly, it's the authorities, since they are the last group to be mentioned in the preceding. If that's the case, it becomes an indictment of them for not seeing the meaning of their scriptures and recognizing Jesus, similar to Ezekiel being an indictment of the leadership of his day. Ezekiel had talked about God as the shepherd of Israel. Here, Jesus, the Word incarnate, speaks of himself as shepherd. Not, as I said above, just shepherd, but good shepherd. What's interesting in this text is that the normal word for good in Greek is agathos. That word is not used here. Rather, the word kalos is used. Kalos is the word that Plato used to label his highest form, the beautiful or the good. So when Jesus speaks of himself as good shepherd, kalos, he's speaking of himself as ultimate, good, prime, key shepherd, not merely morally good. So, let's begin with the structure of the narrative unit. First, Jesus presents a figurative story, the picture which illustrates, drawn from everyday pastoral life concerning shepherds, thieves, and robbers. He then continues presenting two interpretations, the thing illustrated, which utilize the picture he has just drawn. The first shows Jesus as the door of the sheepfold, and the second, Jesus as the shepherd of the sheep. As he's done elsewhere in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus takes a single picture and presses it in different ways to present different lessons. Finally, to set the scene, here's a picture of some sheep in Israel. This picture shows what the sheep enclosure might look like. The entryway toward the right center of the picture. Lastly, this is a picture of a shepherd with his flock on a road in the hills of Israel. Despite the fact that the sheep seem to be wandering, the shepherd has control and is able to keep together his sheep and keep them safe. As we said, the text begins with no connection to the preceding, but rather with the solemn declaratory formula, Amen, Amen, I say to you. In other words, as we've seen before, listen up. There's something significant, something important coming. Then Jesus begins to paint the picture. The one who does not come through the gate into the sheepfold, but climbing up another way, that one is a thief and a robber. Now the image here is an enclosed area where a shepherd would keep his sheep, usually for the night, which has one entryway, the gate or the door. Those who are for the good of the sheep come through that door. Others may climb over the wall or find other ways of getting to the sheep. But they're not interested in the good of the sheep, only their own gain. They want to take the sheep from the shepherd. It's interesting that these are mentioned first. These pictures give a good idea of what the area where the sheep might be housed at night looks like. It's enclosed around, having one entryway or gate, yet the wall is not very high, so a robber can get in. The shepherd at night sleeps across the door, so any intruder must pass through him. Now the shepherd is introduced. The one who does come through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The shepherd is the authorized caretaker of the flock. As such, he's dedicated, courageous, and vigilant, because he's the owner of the sheep. A third character that's introduced in this picture is the gatekeeper, who opens the gate to the shepherd. This one has a very small role. He may, in fact, be a sub-shepherd, indicating that in the gated area there are several flocks settling down for the night. The relationship of the sheep to the shepherd is then described. The sheep hear the voice of the shepherd. His own sheep he calls by name. The introduction of the word his own implies that there are sheep who are not his own. That is, several flocks. The name indicates that the shepherd would give nicknames to their sheep, another sign of the relationship between the shepherd and the sheep. This may remind us of God calling some of his closest servants, and even Israel as a whole, by name, as we hear in Isaiah 43:1. Having gathered his own flock, the shepherd leads them out into the pasture. On the way to the pasture, the shepherd leads his own going before them, and the sheep thus follow the shepherd. This picture fits the notion of discipleship in the Christian community very well. Beasley Murray points out a very interesting fact. It's the butcher who goes behind the flock, driving them to their end. The shepherd leads, giving them life. The butcher drives, leading them to death. But some wonder how the sheep will stay together if there's no one behind them. Many times a helper or sub-shepherd would watch the rear of the flock to be sure that the sheep stay in line. Why do the sheep follow the shepherd? They trust him. They realize his care for them. They know his voice. Again, a picture of a shepherd with his staff resting with his sheep. These type of pastoral scenes are very common in the Holy Land today, just as common as they were in the time of Christ. The description of the picture closes with a contrast introduced by the Greek particle de. The stranger. The stranger the sheep will not follow. It's interesting that the Greek word employed for stranger here indicates one who has absolutely nothing to do with the sheep. In fact, the stranger may be the thieves and robbers introduced at the beginning. Realizing that the stranger is up to no good regarding the sheep, they flee from him, since his is a voice that they do not recognize. Then an editorial comment follows, explaining what has just transpired. Jesus said this figure to them, that is, to the Jewish leaders, but they did not know that he was saying it to them. The word that's used to describe the picture just painted is paroimia, drawn from two Greek words, para meaning beside, as we saw before, and oimos meaning a way or a highway. So it's something by the way. In other words, a proverb or an adage. As such, it was meant to carry a deeper hidden meaning, intended by Jesus for the Jewish leaders. However, as the editor notes, they didn't know it was meant for them, and so they didn't get it. We now come to the first interpretation of the picture as presented by Jesus. It's connected to the preceding picture through the use of the particle un, meaning therefore. The particle may be used to clarify the misunderstanding of the leaders. Jesus begins once again with the solemn formula, Amen, amen, I say to you. Recall that particularly in John's Gospel, this formula is to pique the interest of the hearer as to the fact that something very important is coming. Jesus then tells us, I am the gate of the sheep. Some have questioned this saying that it should say, I am the shepherd of the sheep. However, that's been discounted by the reading door or gate that's been generally accepted. This may refer to the practice of the first century Middle Eastern shepherds to sleep across the door or the gate of the pen that we mentioned earlier as a further means of security. Hence, if that be the case, Jesus the shepherd would also be door or gate. As early as the time of St. John Chrysostom, there was a question, but Chrysostom notes that both are involved in the interpretation of the picture. He says, when he, Jesus, brings us to the Father, he calls himself a door. When he takes care of us, a shepherd. Further, Maloney notes that the use of the door indicates that the single means of access to all that is good is Jesus. Now, he continues, all, as many as came before me are robbers and thieves. This may be a reference to the text of Ezekiel 34 that we mentioned above, where the leaders of Israel were shepherds who didn't care for the flock, but rather for themselves and their own gain at the expense of the flock. But the sheep did not hear them. The fathers of the church saw the thieves and robbers as false messiahs, such as Judas the Galilean or Theudas, who are mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. But the use of the present tense of the verb to be, are, implies that they're much closer to home, the scribes and the Pharisees who are hearing this discourse, more than likely. Continuing, Jesus reiterates the interpretation, I am the gate. Then he takes the meaning to the theological level. If one should enter through me, he will be saved. In other words, entrance through the gate that is Jesus leads to salvation. Through the gate, the sheep enter and exit the pen. Arnold sees a connection to Joshua, the successor to Moses, to whom it fell to lead the Israelites into the promised land. Moses describes him in the book of Numbers as follows. May the Lord appoint a man over this community to go out and to come in before them, one who will lead them out and bring them in. So the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd. Numbers 27:16 through 17. Now, a number of things should be noted. First, the Hebrew name Joshua is translated into Iesus in Greek, which in English is Jesus. The connection of coming in and going out, along with the mention of sheep, points to this allusion showing Joshua as a type a prefigurement of Jesus Christ as the shepherd of God's people, Israel. Then the purpose for going in and going out is given: to find pasture. Yet another allusion to another famous Old Testament passage on shepherds, Psalm 23, in particular verse 2. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Notice also that Psalm 23 begins with the line, "The Lord Adonai is my shepherd." Yet another text emphasizing Jesus as the shepherd of the flock. Thus all these are preparing for the introduction of the second interpretation of the picture. Now from the shepherd, attention now shifts to the thief, who's portrayed as coming to the sheepfold for no good. His purpose is to steal, to kill, to destroy. Three verbs which spell devastation for the flock. The thief stands in direct contrast to the shepherd. Where the shepherd saves and provides pasture, the thief kills and destroys. We may summarize that the thieves mentioned here are the religious leaders who are hearing this parable. They failed in their duty to their people. The first interpretation ends with Jesus commenting on his mission vis-a-vis the thieves and robbers. I came in order that they may have life and have it abundantly. The notion of having life is achieving salvation, being saved. This statement is in the present tense, implying that the life Jesus brings is not something to be expected in the future. It has begun now, in the present. Note that the notion of having life has been seen in several places in the gospel thus far. We saw it in the first session as part of the basic purpose for the writing of the gospel, John 20:30-31. We saw it in the dialogue with Nicodemus. Again, we saw it in the bread of life discourse, and again, finally, it appears here. We now come to the second interpretation of the picture presented at the beginning. No longer is Jesus the gate, but rather now Jesus identifies himself as the shepherd. I am the good shepherd. As we noted above, the Greek here does not use the normal word for good. Rather, it uses a special word, kalos, which can be translated as noble or genuine. That implies that he contrasts with all who claim or are claiming to be shepherds of humankind, but are powerless to save. Thus, Jesus contrasts with the other shepherds, especially those mentioned in Ezekiel 34. The specification of what that noble or genuine means is then given. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. We're reminded of David as he argued with Saul to allow him to fight with the giant Goliath. David was willing to risk his life for his sheep, both literal and figurative. Then the contrast of the second interpretation. The hired hand, the mistos. A hired hand is not a shepherd. Rather, he works for a wage, a mistos. He's not an owner of the sheep. Thus, when there's a crisis situation, a thief or a wild animal or a wolf coming, the hired hand leaves the sheep and flees the scene. In contemporary business practice, I can see the hired hand saying, "Wolves, they're not in my job description." The result is that the sheep have no one to protect them, and the wolf is free to plunder and scatter them. Just to add emphasis, Jesus reiterates that the hired hand flees because he's a hireling, because he's a salaried worker, and as such he cares nothing for the sheep. More than likely, in a push-comes-to-shove situation, he cares more about himself than the sheep. One final note. The verb scatter appears in one other unit in John's Gospel. The prediction at the Last Supper of the disciples being scattered at the time of the crucifixion. John 16:32. Having drawn the comparison between the shepherd and the hired hand, Jesus now returns to the primary interpretation, reiterating, I am the good shepherd. The fact that the good shepherd will lay down his life for his sheep initiates that special relationship between the sheep and shepherd that is now described. I know mine, and mine know me. That mutual relationship is a reflection of yet another mutual relationship, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. The relationship that exists between Jesus and the Father. So our relationship with Jesus is an image of Jesus' relationship with the Father. Now, let's take a look at the verb know. In the common Greco-Roman understanding with which we are familiar, to know is to see or to grasp the nature of something, to know facts about something, to have knowledge of something. The Semitic sense of the verb know is quite different. It's not merely intellectual, it's experiential. Thus, to know God is to have a deep, intimate religious experience of the presence of God in one's life. It's not just the ability to rattle off a number of propositions and statements about God. The Semitic sense of know is intimate, trusting relationship, a deep caring for. That's what Jesus says about his relationship with us. It's intimate, it's trusting, it's experiential, just as it images and mirrors his relationship with the Father. So to know Jesus is to experience him intimately, trustingly, deeply. We come now to what I consider a key diagram of the relations just described. At the center of the diagram, we have Jesus, who is also known as the Son, who is the shepherd. At the lower right of the diagram, we have the community, or in the shepherd image, the sheep. Between these, there is a mutual relationship. At the upper left, we have the Father, who also has a mutual relationship with Jesus, the Son. This relationship is mirrored in the relation of Jesus to the community. Finally, these mutual relationships can be described by several verbs. In the current discussion, the verb know is implied. However, recall that in chapter 6 in the Bread of Life discourse, we saw that he who eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me and I in him, just as the Father remains in me and I in him. Also, we can see it with the verbs see and believe, etc. Then Jesus picks up on what it is that made the Good Shepherd good, that he lays down his life for his sheep. Just as any shepherd is willing to give his all for his sheep, so Jesus, the Good Shepherd, is willing to lay down his life for his sheep. This concept shows how this Good Shepherd parable grounds the picture of Jesus in the Passion narrative. On the cross, our shepherd does indeed lay down his life for us, his sheep. As the narrative draws to a conclusion, this notion will be fleshed out a bit more. Then, another aspect of Jesus as shepherd is introduced. He has more than one flock. He says, I have other sheep who are not from this fold. Now, the question has emerged throughout the centuries as to just who these other sheep are, or might be. In the earliest days of the church, they were thought to be the believers in Jesus who were not part of the Johannine community. Those around Peter, those around the communities founded by Paul and his companions. As the faith grew, they were thought to be the Gentile believers in Jesus. In our own times, the other sheep are generally seen to be other believers in Jesus who belong to denominations other than the Catholic Church. Hence, texts such as this are prominent readings for church unity celebrations. Unity, indeed, is the context of the next statements of Jesus. Jesus must lead these other sheep. The Greek verb dei implies that necessity. It's necessary that I lead them. There's no choice. Hence, they will hear my voice as the shepherd hear the shepherd's voice, and there will be one flock, one shepherd. Despite multiple communities in the early church, despite multiple communities in our contemporary churches, the day is coming when all will be one under the one good shepherd, Jesus. Continuing the theme of the shepherd, Jesus, laying down his life for his sheep, Jesus says, on account of this, the Father loves me. As we saw earlier in the gospel, the motive for Jesus becoming one of us and dying for us is God's love. God's love for us, and now God's love for Jesus. Then this is defined, that he lays down his life in order that he might take it up again. We have here a veiled reference to the crucifixion, lay down one's life. But also now is added the resurrection, take it up again. In fact, the purpose of the crucifixion is precisely the resurrection. This is a repetition and an expansion of what was said a few verses earlier in John 10:15. And it echoes the Nicodemus episodes, John 3:16, where the Father gives his only begotten Son, a text that I alluded to above. Then a rather interesting addition. No one takes it from me, Jesus says. I lay it down of myself. In John's narrative of Jesus' passion, we will see that Jesus is totally in charge. Nothing happens without his permitting it. Hence, his life is not taken from him. He freely lays it down. Then Jesus reiterates what he has just said. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. Beasley Murray puts it well in terms of our relational diagram. The mutual love of the Father and the Son was thus seen in a deed of love for the world, in which the Father in love willed to save all people, and the Son in love freely gave all. Thus the Good Shepherd interpretation ends, noting that the crucifixion and the resurrection are intrinsically related as manifestations of the Father's and the Son's love. Jesus acts out of love, but at the Father's command of love. As we have seen several times before, the result of Jesus' words is division. On the one side, many saw him as they had previously, talking like a mad, possessed man. He has a demon, some say. He's mad. Therefore, why even waste the time to pay attention to him? Or, as some translators put it, why should we continue to listen to this one? On the other side, they were saying, these are not words from one possessed by a demon. No demon is able to open the eyes of the blind. Those who are on Jesus' side recognize what has transpired with the blind man in the previous narrative. That cannot be the work of a man possessed by a demon. It can only be the work of one sent by the Lord. There's a veiled reference to Psalm 146:8, where it is the Lord who gives sight to the blind. So if they read their own scriptures, they would have the right answer. Well, that's about all we have time for in this session. Next time, we'll look at the last of the 7 signs in John's Gospel, the raising of Lazarus. Jesus has shown power over nature. He's multiplied loaves. He's changed water into wine, cured the sick and the blind. Now he tackles the greatest of them all, death. In the raising of Lazarus, he will show his power over death, which will prefigure in his own greatest act, the conquering of death in the resurrection. See you then.